Starting off at number 10 now, we have the Demon Bridge of County Monaghan. This is a story of death. The demon bride is said to have terrorized funeral goers for at least 200 years. Her victims now lie in the churchyards where they fell. Across County Monaghan, people report the same thing. The demon bride watches funerals and waits as the deceased are laid to rest. As everyone leaves, the demon bride approaches a young man straggling behind. She transforms into a beautiful young woman and makes him promise to meet her a month from that day back there at the graveyard. She seals the deal with a kiss and then vanishes. As he leaves the graveyard, his blood runs cold and a deep sense of despair washes over him. He realizes he has sold his body and soul to the evil spirit and his life has been forfeited. Over the next month, he descends into madness before eventually dying. He is laid to rest in the same graveyard as before, exactly a month after he first met the demon bride, his promise fulfilled. Next up at number 9 now, we have the Banshee. The Banshee is a female spirit that wails in the night as a sign that death is coming for a family member. Legend says the Banshee has long streaming hair, wears a grey cloak over a green dress, and her eyes are red from constant weeping. According to the Ancient Legends of Ireland book, the Banshee may be seen at night as a shrouded woman crouched beneath the trees, lamenting with veiled face or flying past the moonlight crying bitterly, and the cry of this spirit is mournful beyond all other sounds on earth and betokens certain death for some member of the family whenever it is heard in the silence of the night. Could not think of a more scary description myself if I tried. Moving on to number 8 now, we have the Dergdu. Many countries have a vampire legend. This is the Irish one. The name translates from Irish as red bloodsucker. Originally, the Dergdu was a normal girl who lived over 2,000 years ago. She was said to be beautiful with blood red lips and pale blonde hair. Her true name has been lost in the sands of time, overshadowed by what she became. Men travelled from all over Ireland in the hopes of just being with her. However, she fell in love with a local man who was very poor. He was perfect for her, but without money, her father would never let them marry. Instead, he married her off to an old, cruel man who abused her. He liked to draw blood from her while she was locked up in a tower cell. One day, she gave up hope of her true love ever rescuing her and committed suicide by refusing to eat. Her dying breath was a vengeance against the living. Her undead corpse rose from the earth on the night she was buried, thirsting for the blood that was taken from her. She was now the Dergdu, stealing blood from children, from the innocent, and especially from young men. She would call to them in the night with a haunting siren song that lured them to their deaths. Some say she still wanders the Irish countryside at night, calling out to her next victim. At number 7 now, we have the Changelings. These are mythical fairy creatures that take the place of a newborn human child that has been stolen by the fairies. The fairies will steal the child to act as a servant for them. Families would try and see if their baby was actually a changeling through a number of different ways. One of them involved placing them over a fire. If the baby was a changeling, it would leave by just climbing up the chimney. The real child would then be returned. It was thought that the fairies preferred to steal baby boys. As a result, many Irish families would dress their baby boys in dresses to confuse the fairies. Moving on to number 6 now, we have the Dullahan. The Dullahan is a headless rider of the night who carries his own head under one arm. His mouth is locked in a hideous grin that touches both sides of his head. His flesh is rotting and he uses the spine of a human for a horsewhip. His job is as a foreteller of death. When he stops riding, a person is due to die. He will call out the person's name, at which point they drop to the floor dead. There is no way to stop the Dullahan. All locks and gates open when he approaches. They don't like being watched either and will throw blood over anyone who dares to do so. This is also taken as a mark that they are among the next to die. Moving on to number 5 now, we have the Fetch. The Fetch is a supernatural double of a living person. You can have your own Fetch. They're like a doppelganger but with much more sinister undertones. Their sightings are regarded as an omen of impending death. If a person sees this dark double of themselves, it's said to mean they are going to die soon. Sometimes the Fetch may even have a clue as to how that person will die, perhaps a bullet wound in the head or a slash across the chest. Either way, it's not something you want to come across in your life. The Fetch is said to appear ghostly or shadowy and may vanish down alleyways or halls if followed. At number 4 now, we have the Puka. According to Irish folklore, these are strange little creatures obsessed with causing as much havoc as possible. They visit farms and seaside communities to tear down fences and disturb the animals there. The creepy part is that the legend says the Puka sometimes just stand outside of a farmhouse and calls the people outside by their name. If anyone anyone steps out, the puka will carry them away forever. There are stories of them being bloodthirsty and vampire-like creatures, as well as ones that describe them as man-eating beings, hunting down, killing, and eating their victims. Next to the number 3 now, we have the Alp Luatra. This creature is also known as the joint eater. Don't worry, it doesn't eat your joints, but this creature does something just as strange. It's said to be a newt-like creature that preys on people who fall asleep near rivers or streams. It jumps down their throat and lives in their stomach so that it can eat the victim's food. In the collection of folk tales called Beside the Fire, a farmer was starving from an Alp Luatra that was in his stomach, and he found a way to get rid of the creature. He ate large amounts of salted meat until he could eat no more. Then he lay by a stream with his mouth open. The Alp Luatra was driven to thirst by all the salt, and eventually they all jumped out of the man and into the water. Gross. Moving on to number 2 now, we have the Black Cat of Killarkey House. There is said to be a beast that wanders the forests of County Dublin around the old Killarkey house. The animal has been sighted for centuries there, and people say it's supernatural. For a lot of people, for a while, this was nothing more than a superstition. That was until 1968 when a young couple bought the Killarkey house and started renovating it. The hired workers there reported strange noises and events, and a big black cat with demonic eyes that haunted them. It would appear and disappear in a moment. The owners didn't believe them until they saw it too, just standing in the hallways staring at them and snarling. The couple got a priest to perform an exorcism on the house, which seemed to get rid of the beast for a while. Then a group of actors held a seance in the house which brought the black cat back, and with many people now saying it still prowls there to this day. And finally, at number 1 now, we have the slough. Some say these spectral creatures are demons, but a closer term would probably be malicious spirits. The slough are dead sinners who have been doomed to spend an eternity hunting for the souls of people who are dying. According to Irish folklore, they come from the west, flying like a flock of birds, trying to enter a house where they sense someone is dying in order to steal their soul and rob them of a happy afterlife. It was said that many families would actually shut their west-facing windows at all times to keep the slough out of their homes. Some folklore experts have compared this to the Wild Hunt, a European folktale about ghostly hounds or spirits travelling around in packs foretelling of death and disaster. Starting off at number 10 now, we have the Derry Vampire. In the city of Derry, you can find an area known as Slaughterverty. There lies a grassy mound known as O'Cathain's Dolmen, marked by a single thorn tree. Legend says that a vampire is contained within it. Back in the 5th century, a chieftain known as Abatak ruled over the area. He was known for his cruelty and viciousness, even to his own tribe. Locals said that he was actually an evil wizard, using his powers to rise to a position of power. When he died, the tribe gave him a respectful burial. They thought that was the end of it. A day later though, his reanimated corpse appeared in the village. He demanded a bowl of fresh human blood, or else he would release his terror upon them. The terrified village turned to help from another local chieftain called Cathain, begging that he kill Abatak. Well, he did. He came and killed Abatak, but he rose again, so he killed him again and again, but still he kept on living, returning to the village in search of human blood. Cathain consulted a Christian hermit for guidance. He directed that Abatak be killed using a wooden sword made of yew. He then had to be buried head downwards, weighted with a heavy stone. Finally, thorn bushes should be planted tightly in a circle around the grave. Somehow, it worked. To this day, the mound still remains. People believe it should be left exactly as it is, or else the vampire will return, demanding human blood. Next up at number 9 now, we have the cottage of Coonean. In Coonean, on the Fermanagh-Tyrone border, lies an old abandoned cottage. In 1911, it belonged to the Murphy family. Legend says they were being plagued by poltergeists, mischievous ghosts that wanted them out. The family chose to stay. Mrs. Murphy was a widow. Her and the children began to hear mysterious noises at night. There were knocks on the door, footsteps in the empty attic above, and strange groans emitting from the walls. This was only the beginning though. Plates began sliding across tables by themselves, and bedcloths moved around in empty beds. Then it started getting even more intense. Pots and pans were thrown violently against the walls while furniture floated off the ground. Even when things weren't being smashed around, a strange coldness permeated the cottage as mysterious shapes appeared and then disappeared through the walls. In the end, a Catholic priest was called in to perform 2 exorcisms, but that didn't work. Locals began to believe the family had brought this evil on themselves and stopped helping them. Finally, the Murphys caved in and emigrated to America in 1913. Locals believe the ghost followed them. Now, over 100 years on, their cottage lies abandoned. People still say an evil atmosphere surrounds it. Next up at number 8 now, we have the Dunsandle mantelpiece. This house in Galway has so many ghost stories attached to it, it's hard to keep track of them. In the early 20th century, a stone worker who was repairing parts of the old house took a shining to one of the mantelpieces. He decided to take it with him back to his workshop. Now, legend says that the ghost of a tall man that haunted the house had somehow attached itself to the mantelpiece and went with it. The workshop then became haunted. Objects would fly around the room. Glasses and other items would smash or break. Perhaps the creepiest thing was the actual sightings of the ghost, often accompanied with sounds of an Irish fiddle playing in the distance. The only way to stop the hauntings was for the stoneworker to return the mantelpiece to Dunstable House, where it remains to this day, along with its ghostly legend. Moving on to number 7 now, we have the Faceless Lady of Belverley Castle. In Cork Harbour lies Belverley Castle. In the 17th century, it's said that a woman named Margaret Hodnett lived there. She loved mirrors. Back then, mirrors were a symbol of luxury and wealth. Not many people owned them. Margaret had many of them so that she could always remind herself of her famous beauty. She had an on and off relationship with a local lord called Clon Rockenby. He asked for her hand in marriage many times, but she always refused. Eventually, he had enough of the rejection and decided to raise a small army to take her castle and her by force. Definitely an overreaction, I'd say. You can't just raise an army if someone doesn't want you. Anyway, the attack didn't go well. Clon was forced to siege the castle. Margaret held on for a year before eventually surrendering. Clon entered the castle to find Margaret starved to death, a skeletal figure, and not the beauty he had sought after for so long. Out of rage, he smashed her favourite mirror to pieces. Then one of Margaret's soldiers killed him with a sword. After that, Margaret descended into madness. She looked for mirrors constantly to see if her beauty had returned, but it never did. She died of old age, and locals say her ghost appears in the castle as a lady in white, sometimes with a veiled face and sometimes with no face at all. They say you can still see her, staring at the walls where mirrors used to hang, tilting her head as if looking at her reflection. Moving on to number 6 now, we have Corny. In the early 20th century, reports began of a ghost called Corny haunting a house in Dublin. The husband had sprained his knee badly and had to use a crutch, thumping around during the day and then leaving it by his bedside at night. One night, the wife woke up to the sound of the same thumping in the night, but her husband was next to her and the crutch was still by their bed. It was actually Corny, a poltergeist who was mocking the husband by thumping around in the night. He wreaked havoc on the house, playing practical jokes on the servants. Some of them were so terrified that they threatened to leave. The wife agreed to move them into a bedroom at the top of the house with a special press bed. On the first night, as they went to bed, the doors of the press bed flung open and Corny's voice called out, "Ha ha, you devils, I am here before you. I am not confined to any particular part of this house." He told them that in life he had been a bad man who had died a bad death. He said he couldn't tell them in what realm he was now because it would anger God. Next up at number 5 now, we have the Dobar Chew. This creature is also known as the King Otter in Irish folklore. It's said to resemble an otter, a dog, and a fish all at once. There have been many documented sightings of it over the years. In the town of Cornwall in County Leitrim lies the grave of a woman who was said to have actually been killed by the Dobar coup in the 17th century. Her headstone says she was called Grain. Legend says her husband supposedly heard her scream one night as she was washing her clothes in the lake. He ran to help her, but when he arrived, she was already dead, her body bloody and mutilated by the creature. The man killed the Dobar Coup by stabbing it right through the heart. As it died, it made a strange whistling noise. At that moment, another Dobar Coup rose up from the water. It was the mate of the first one. The man fought and killed that one too. Since then, many people know there may be more out there. Some have reported seeing and even fighting them to the death. Moving on to number 4 now, we have the Whispering Mummies. St. Michan's Church is a 330-year-old building that is built on an even more ancient burial ground. Catacombs and grave vaults lie in the darkness below the church with coffins full of well-preserved mummies. Visitors report strange, whispering voices down there, along with an oppressive feeling in the tight hallways. It's a feeling of being in a crowd of people, despite there being nobody around. Some have even reported feeling unseen hands touching them. on the back of their necks. For people that go there, the feeling of being in a spirit crowd when they can't see anyone is a very unnerving experience. Moving on to number 3 now, we have the Sligo Mansion. On the Coolera Peninsula in Sligo, a man called William Phibbs built a stately mansion known as Seafield House. It overlooked the sea, and with over 20 rooms, it was a detestable symbol of wealth during the Irish Great Famine. Locals thought that he was a cruel and uncaring landlord. By the early 20th century, his descendant, Owen Phibbs, was using the mansion to store Egyptian artifacts and mummies there. Not long after, there were reports of a poltergeist terrorizing the house. According to some servants, the house would shake and objects would smash into the walls. A ghostly horse-drawn coach was seen trotting up the driveway. Priests were called in to perform several exorcisms, but the activity wouldn't cease. Eventually, it got so bad, even the Phibbs family were driven away. Next up at number 2 now, we have the Murdered Jester. Malahide Castle in Dublin was built by King Henry II of England in the 12th century. It hosted grand medieval feasts, complete with minstrels and jesters for entertainment. One of the jesters, named Puck, saw a female prisoner at a feast one night and fell in love with her. He tried to help her escape, but was stabbed to death outside of the castle by the guards. In his dying breath, he vowed to haunt the place forever. Since then, there have apparently been many sightings of him. Visitors report seeing and photographing his spectral features appearing in the thick ivy that grows on the castle walls near where he was killed. And finally, number 1 now, we have the Vanishing Island. On July 7th, 1878, the residents of Ballycotton in County Cork were shocked to see an island out there in the ocean that had never been there before. Locals stood on the shoreline in absolute disbelief. They could see woodlands, fields, and deep valleys. Fishermen sailed out to investigate, but as they approached, the island flickered out of existence. This isn't an isolated case either. Similar sightings have occurred in County Kerry, County Clare, and Ballina Lane Bay in Galway. Some have tried to explain the sightings of the Vanishing Island as a trick of the light, an optical illusion due to light refraction. Others link it to the old Irish legend of a vanishing island that becomes visible once every 7 years. I did some calculations, and if that's true, then 2018 is also a year where it should appear again. So keep your eyes peeled for that story. What do you guys think of this? Trick of the light, parallel universe, or spectral island?
Number 10, the Dear Do. I always find it fascinating how we can find similar breadcrumbs around the world that depict legends of vampires. The Celtic depiction of the vampire is the Dear Do, and the story behind her is heartbreaking. The Dear Do once was a breathtaking, beautiful woman who had given her love to an innocent farm boy. But her father was greedy and arranged her to marry an abusive chieftain for wealth and land. No amount of begging could save her from her fate, and unfortunately, the marriage went through. After the wedding day, the woman fell into a deep depression, not eating or drinking until her body wasted away. Her lost love visited the grave every single day, wishing her to return, but come the year anniversary of her death, it was revenge that brought her back. She went straight to her father's bed and sucked the life from him. Not yet sated, she went of course to her brutal husband and, finding him surrounded by women in lustful acts, flew into a rage and not only sucked out his soul, but drained all the blood from his body. Every year on the anniversary of her death, she rises to seduce young men before devouring their blood. So, to this day, on the anniversary of her death in Waterford, people place rocks on her grave so she cannot rise from the earth. But sometimes, if the rocks aren't heavy enough, the Dear Do escapes, seeking to sate her bloodlust. Number 9, the Dullahan. The Dullahan is a foreboding headless horseman who's set to ride during festival days. He is said to be one of the most terrifying creatures who resides in the spirit world. Some consider him the angel of death. He rides a jet black stallion, and his flowing black cape blazes behind him while he rides. But his head does not sit on his shoulders, but is held in his hand. It is said that his eyes can see for miles at night, but the most terrifying thing about him is if you see him. If you don't avert your eyes as he rides past, you may get struck by a bucket of blood, or lose sight in one of your eyes. But beware if his steed begins to slow and approach you, for if he stops before you and calls your name, your soul will be sucked from your body. His only weakness is gold, so instead of trying to outrun him, carry a piece of gold in your pocket to ward him off. You know, just because everybody has gold, I guess. Number 8, speaking of creatures you don't want to encounter at night, next up we have the Banshee. The Banshee can appear in many forms, so Some say she appears as a beautiful woman in a shroud, or a headless naked hag holding a bucket of blood. But even more terrifying than her appearance is her song. The banshee is an omen of death and is said to appear to warn of violent death, either of a loved one or for the listener. Some banshees even do the killing themselves, while other legends say they are spirits tied to their loved ones and sing songs of care and concern for the ones about to pass. At one time in Ireland, it was considered blasphemous not to believe in banshees, and some older generations still believe to this day. Real or superstition, the legend of the banshee is a haunting story of an inescapable fate. Number 7, Balor and the Evil Eye. Balor was a legendary ancient being who existed long before the Tuatha De Danann, a race of godlike people with supernatural powers. When Balor was a young man, he spied on his father and his druids as they performed a spell to lay waste the land. Vapors from the spell infected his eye, enlarging it and granting it the power of death. Balor himself was said to be enormous, so large in fact that it took 4 men to lift his eyelid open for use. Whatever met his gaze would wither and die, including grass, trees, and even turn men to stone. But on the same day he was created, the druids prophesied he would be killed by his grandson. So, of course, he locked his daughter away. But of course, someone snuck in, had 3 babies with her, and though Balor drowned 2 of them, the third snuck away and finally killed him one day in battle. Number 6, the Kelpie, also known as the Nope horse. This is the creature grannies warn their grandchildren about to keep them away from the water. And no, I'm not talking about the Australian dog breed. That's adorable. Kelpies are horses that linger near rivers and bodies of water that seem harmless at first, but if you try and ride them, you will stick to them and they will drag you to the depths to consume you, like a sticky horse. But if horses don't tempt you, they also can appear as beautiful women to lure you in with their feminine wiles. Or they can appear as hairy humanoids that wait in trees and leap on unsuspecting travelers and smash them. Depictions of these creatures are absolutely terrifying, and I can't even imagine what it would be like to be dragged underwater by a very sticky horse. They can also summon up sudden floods and rapids to drown unsuspecting victims. However, Kelpies do have a weak spot. If you do find them disguised as horses, if you get a hold of their bridle, it must serve you, giving you the strength and stamina of over 10 horses. Number 5, Carmen. If you're keeping track of evil witches, make sure to add this woman to your list. Carmen was an evil witch who terrorized the land along with her 4 sons: darkness, evil, and violence. Yeah. She placed a vicious blight on the crops of Ireland until the gods of Tuatha De Danann brought their magic against her. They drove her sons across the sea and imprisoned her, but were tasked with throwing a festival in her name each year, otherwise the land would be faced with a blight. Carmen reportedly died of grief in 600 BCE, and the festival is held every 3 years on August 1st. Number 4, the Fae. If you're already a fan of Irish folklore, then you may already be familiar with imps or the Fae. And the reasons why we fear them. Fairy lore, I think, is the next vampire craze. They're mysterious, immortal, powerful, and very sexy. What else could you want? But you may want to think twice before wandering into the woods hoping for some handsome Fae man to take you away. Probably not a good idea. Anyone who knows the lore of the Fae will warn you not to take them lightly. They love to mess with mortals and are notoriously known for stealing babies in the dead of night to replace them with possessed changelings. Though they could sometimes be friendly, they often look for ways to trick you. So, if you do want to get on their good side, here are a few very important rules to follow. Number 1, do not call them fairy. It is an insult. Call them good neighbor, imp, elf, or Seelie White. Number 2, always turn your socks inside out when going for a hike. The imps will not be able to lead you astray and make you impossibly lost. Number 3, if they offer you food, deny it. It's a sure way to become trapped in the fairy realm. But like, if that's what you want, I mean, do it. Though I would expect some torment if you do, so probably don't. Number 4, never lie to them. They will never lie to you, but they have a way of twisting words. But if you want respect, you gotta give respect. Number 5, if you accept a gift, you must give one greater in return, but do not say thank you. It means you owe whatever they ask in return. And lastly, number 6, carry iron or salt with you to protect against the darker imps. Anyways, there is a couple tips for you, but if you do come across one, don't brag about it. They hate that. Number 3, the Dark Man. Now, I mentioned that some imps are mischievous and even dangerous, but there is one being even they fear, the Dark Man. He who lurks, he who stalks, the dark druid. Even whispering his name invites his attention. So let's hope I'm not in trouble here, guys. Some say he is a shadow man with malevolent powers. Others say he serves the Queen of the Cid coldly and without remorse, claiming anyone she calls for. those he took were never heard from again. The fact that our good neighbors fear him so much is enough to say that we should too, especially considering the story of the taking of Finn's wife. The dark man fell in love with a beautiful woman who spurned his love, so of course he cursed her by turning her into a fawn. The only way she could be released was if she found her true love, and that she did. Once she entered the house of the wise Finn McCool, she was safe. For years they lived together until Finn went off to battle. When he returned home, he discovered the chief being deceived and taken by the dark druid who appeared in his likeness. Finn never saw her again. Number 2, the Avertalk. Some may know Vlad the Impaler as the main inspiration for the character of Dracula, but considering Bram Stoker's Irish heritage, the origins of this famous villain may have been closer to home. The Irish king Avertalk ruled between Dungiven and Garva and was abhorred by his people. But despite his awful reputation, his name isn't that intimidating. It's actually an old Irish name that means deaf fellow, and many believe he was also a man of small stature. Some say he was a dwarf, others say that he just lost his legs in an accident so he was shorter. He was an evil and cruel wizard, hated and feared by his clans. He was also insanely jealous and suspected his wife of having an affair. So one night he slipped out a window and tried to peer into a room to catch her in the act, but instead he slipped and fell to his death. Yay, I guess. The people, relieved to see his demise, buried him right away, standing upright in the ground as for his kingliness he needed to be. Sitting upright in the ground, which was tradition. But the next morning, he appeared demanding bowls of blood from his people, freshly poured from their wrists. The people begged a neighboring chieftain to save them, and he tried to kill him not once, but 3 times, yet still he would appear the next morning, demanding blood. The chieftain sought the advice from a neighboring saint, and this time when he killed him, he buried him upside down, stabbed him in the heart with a stake from the yew tree, piled ash wood on top of him, and placed atop the grave a heavy stone slab. You can still visit the grave to this day, but locals still fear the sight, and some have even had very eerie experiences. Ooh. Number 1. The Slua. There's one night a year that you should fear the Slua, spirits of death who show no mercy to whoever crosses their path. The only way to dissuade them from taking your soul is if you offer up another soul in return. You may know this night as Halloween, but those who believe in Celtic folklore call it Samhain. Some say they used to be imps who became twisted and warped by dark magic. It is said they fly from the west in a dark mass, seeking souls to drag back with them into the darkness. On Samhain, fires were forbidden so as not to attract them to your door, and windows on the west side of the house were locked shut. They are also locked tight if someone in the house is ill or dying, as the Slua often delight in stealing souls before they can give their last rites. But you can also call them to you by saying their name aloud. So, like, guess I'm screwed. And with that, we end our top 10. I guess you will see what happens tonight to see if that tale is true. I hope it isn't. Wish me luck, and someone show me where to get an iron horseshoe. Good thing my window faces north, I guess.